Why is it that the moment you become softer, more understanding, more forgiving, more available, the world seems to quietly step back from you, not with open hostility, not with rejection you can fight against, but with something far more disorienting: indifference, delayed responses, fading interest, the slow evaporation of attention, until one day you realize you are no longer seen as central, only optional. And the most unsettling part is that you didn't do anything wrong. You were patient, you listened, you empathized, you excused, you stayed, you absorbed, you gave, and yet you were ignored. So the question forms, heavy and humiliating: why does being good make me invisible? And most people will rush to soothe that wound with moral platitudes, telling you that kindness is its own reward, or that the world is cruel and blind. But Carl Jung would stop you right there, because Jung was not interested in comforting illusions. He was interested in psychological truth, and the truth is this: excessive kindness is rarely perceived as virtue. It is perceived as a signal that your boundaries are flexible, that your needs are secondary, that your presence is guaranteed regardless of how you are treated. And the human psyche, efficient and instinctual, reads that signal immediately, not consciously, but at the level of behavior, posture, timing, tone, and energy. And once that signal is read, a quiet recalibration happens. You are no longer something to be invested in, you are something to be accessed when convenient. And Jung would say that this dynamic does not begin in adulthood. It begins much earlier, in childhood, in environments where love was conditional, where approval had to be earned, where conflict felt dangerous, and the child learned a subtle but powerful lesson: to survive, I must be agreeable, I must be easy, I must not disrupt. So the child learned to read moods, to anticipate needs, to smooth tension before it exploded. And this strategy worked. It kept connection intact. It reduced chaos. It preserved belonging. But what works for survival in childhood often becomes sabotage in adulthood, because the adult who still uses this strategy confuses adaptation with identity, and what they call kindness is often a compulsion, not a choice. And Jung would call this the formation of a persona, a social mask designed to be acceptable, safe, likable. And the persona of the good one is among the most socially rewarded masks early on, praised by parents, teachers, authority figures. But here is the psychological cost. Every trait that does not fit the persona is pushed into the shadow: anger, selfishness, assertiveness, the capacity to say no, the willingness to disappoint, the right to withdraw. All of it is buried, not eliminated. And the shadow does not disappear. It waits, it accumulates energy, it leaks out sideways, through resentment, exhaustion, passive withdrawal, emotional numbness, and paradoxically through being ignored. Because Jung warned that when a person identifies exclusively with goodness, they become psychologically one-sided. And one-sidedness always creates imbalance, and imbalance is felt by others even if it is never articulated. Because relationships are not governed by conscious ideals. They are governed by unconscious dynamics: power, reciprocity, tension, presence. And when you are too kind, what others feel, without being able to name it, is that there is no cost to crossing you, no risk in delaying you, no consequence for taking more than they give. And this is not because they are evil, it is because the psyche defaults to efficiency. It invests where there is resistance, where there is structure, where there is a sense of another self that will not dissolve on contact. Jung observed this repeatedly in his clinical work: people who gave endlessly and were shocked to find themselves depleted and disregarded. And Jung did not tell them to harden their hearts, he told them to integrate their shadow, because the shadow is not only destructive, the impulses, it is also vitality, self-respect, the instinct to protect one's own psychic territory. And until that instinct is integrated, kindness remains ungrounded. It floats, it spreads, it leaks, and what leaks is not respected. And this is where the illusion breaks, because most people believe they are ignored because they are not enough, not interesting enough, not attractive enough, not impressive enough. But Jung would say the opposite is often true. They are ignored because they are too available, too predictable, too self-sacrificing, and the psyche does not attach value to what does not appear to value itself. And this is the part that stings, because it means that being ignored is not a verdict on your worth, it is feedback on the signal you are emitting. And the signal says, I will stay even if you don't meet me. And when that signal is consistent, the dynamic settles into place. Messages slow, invitations stop, attention drifts, and you are left confused, replaying interactions, wondering what changed, when in reality nothing changed. The pattern simply completed itself. Jung would call this fate, not because it is mystical, But because it is unconscious, what is not made conscious is lived out again and again as destiny, and until you see that your kindness is entangled with fear, fear of conflict, fear of abandonment, fear of being seen as difficult, you will keep reliving this pattern with different faces, different contexts, different names, and here is the deeper layer Jung points to. When you suppress your shadow, others are forced to carry it for you, meaning that the aggression you do not express will appear in them. The disrespect you do not allow yourself will be enacted by others. The boundaries you do not set will be crossed by someone else, and then you conclude that the world is cruel when in reality the world is mirroring your internal split. And this is why being too kind often leads to being ignored rather than cherished. Because kindness without limits is not love, it is appeasement, and appeasement is read as weakness. Not morally, but energetically, psychologically, and Jung was very clear on this. Love without power is not love, it is dependency. And power here does not mean control over others, it means ownership of oneself, the capacity to say yes and no with equal integrity, the ability to withdraw without guilt, the willingness to let others experience the consequences of their behavior. And when this power is absent, kindness becomes a currency you spend to buy security, and any currency that is overprinted loses value. Now think of the moments when you were ignored. Notice the pattern. Was it after you asserted a clear boundary, or was it after you overextended yourself? After you explained too much, after you forgave without repair, after you stayed when leaving would have been very respect. Most people are not ignored after they stand their ground, they are ignored after they abandon it. And Jung would say that the psyche of others senses this abandonment long before the conscious mind catches up. And this is why people who are warm but grounded, empathetic but selective, kind but not endlessly accommodating, are treated differently. Because their kindness has weight, it is scarce, it is chosen. It is not available to anyone who asks. And scarcity creates value not because of manipulation, but because it signals self-possession, and this is where the transformation begins. Not when you become colder, but when you become whole. When you allow your anger to exist without acting it out destructively. When you allow yourself to disappoint without collapsing into guilt. When you allow silence to replace over-explanation, because silence, when it comes from groundedness, recalibrates relationships. It forces the other to meet you or lose access. And many will choose to drift away, not because you became worse, but because the old contract no longer exists. The contract where you gave and they took. Jung would say this is the individuation process in action. The painful but necessary movement from adaptation to authenticity, and individuation is always lonely at first, because you are shedding relationships that were built around your self-erasure. And here is the paradox Jung highlights. The more integrated you become, the fewer people you may have, but the more real those connections will be, because they are no longer based on your willingness to disappear. And this is where the fear arises, the fear that if you stop being so kind, you will be abandoned. But Jung would counter that what leaves at that point was never truly connected to you, it was connected to your compliance. And compliance is not intimacy. Intimacy requires two intact selves, and intact selves require boundaries, and boundaries require the shadow, the part of you that says this is enough. This does not work for me. This costs too much. And when you integrate that part, your kindness changes texture. It becomes quieter, firmer, less performative. You stop proving your goodness. You stop explaining your intentions. You stop rushing to reassure, and something subtle shifts. People either lean in with respect or drift out entirely, and both outcomes are information, not failure. Jung would say that at this stage you are no longer asking to be seen, you are allowing yourself to be seen, and there is a profound difference. Because asking implies lack, allowing implies presence, and presence is what commands attention without demanding it. And this brings us to the most uncomfortable truth of all. People ignore you when you are too kind because you are ignoring parts of yourself. Your limits, your anger, your right to take up space, your right to withdraw. And the psyche of others mirrors that self-neglect with surgical precision. So the work is not to ask how to be kinder, but where you are being kind out of fear rather than choice. Where you are giving to avoid tension rather than to express love. Where you are staying to avoid loss rather than because there is mutuality. Because every time you choose kindness over truth, you teach the world that your truth is optional. And Jung would say that truth, not niceness, is the foundation of respect, and respect is the soil in which real connection grows. So the path forward is not dramatic. It does not require confrontation or speeches. It requires quiet, internal shifts, letting messages go unanswered when there is no reciprocity, saying no without justification, leaving spaces where you once overfilled silence, allowing others to feel your absence, not as punishment, but as reality. And when you do this, something almost unsettling happens. You stop being ignored, not because you demand attention, but because you are no longer invisible to yourself, and when you see yourself clearly, the world adjusts, sometimes slowly, sometimes abruptly, but always truthfully. And this is what Carl Jung meant when he said that one does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious. Because when you integrate your darkness, your kindness is no longer a plea, it is a presence, and presence is something the psyche cannot ignore, even if it tries. And if this resonates with you, it may be because you are standing at that threshold. Jung described the moment where being good is no longer enough and being whole becomes unavoidable.